Our governor signed a resolution passed by the legislature supporting a convention of states, which means a challenge to our U.S. Constitution. Now, what is important is a good knowledge. This evening, we're not advocating either position. We're simply presenting the facts from our noted speaker, Professor Cal Jillson, from SMU University. And he's going to present the facts so that we have enough information to make a mature decision. Let's use that word. All right. Now, I want to have to make a footnote. We're going to have a question and answer session. All right. I want you to be free to make your inquiries, but I don't want editorials. I don't want someone to give 3 minutes of their opinion. This isn't CNN News, okay? We want to go and have a question, answer, then direct that question. But with that, will you please welcome me, Texas' tremendous historian and political scientist, Professor Cal Jillson.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. I have been asked to talk about the governor's proposal for a constitutional convention, a convention of states. And as Richard said, what I'm going to try to do is not to advocate one side or the other, but to give a sense of what the process would be, what the issues would be, and why some people are worried about a convention of the states to amend the federal constitution, and why other people think it would be a good idea. And I'm going to try to do that in such a way as to not ruin Talia's sense of what college might be. So I'm going to try to do my best here so that she doesn't leave and tell her grandma, geez, I had no idea what that was going to be like. But Collin College is a great school. I have the pleasure of being over there every once in a while. And you can get a really good education at Collin College. And I'll tell you, if you do well at Collin College, SMU then has a bunch of 50% and in some cases 100% scholarships for your last 2 years. So get out there and get after it at Collin College, and then look up, because there are a lot of 4-year universities around the state, that are very interested in students that do well at community college, because they're tested, they've already shown their mettle, and so you have a great opportunity and a wonderful life ahead of you. So congratulations on what you've done so far and what you're going to do. I have to tell you before I get started here, and planning to talk for about maybe 40 minutes, then we'll do 20 minutes question and answer. But I have to tell you, I speak to about 10 Democrat audiences for every Republican audience I speak to. Because the Democrats call on me and they say, Professor Jillson, what can we do? What issues should we talk about? What can we say so that voters will give us a look? And I say, I'm not sure what you can do. Republicans don't feel the need to call a college professor and ask them what they might do to win elections. They've been winning a lot of elections lately, particularly in Collin County and Benton County and around and statewide. So it's not that I pick and choose. It's just that a lot of more Democrat groups have questions about what they might do in the upcoming election. Not as many Republican groups do. So it's a particular pleasure to get here tonight. And what we're going to talk about is conventions of the states, constitutional conventions, and the constitutions that they produce, and what those mean for democratic politics. Because Governor Greg Abbott proposed in his 2016 book, Broken but Unbowed, a convention of the states to consider amendments to the United States Constitution. Abbott argued that the federal government had overstepped its bounds and was acting illegally outside its constitutional parameters, and so a series of constitutional amendments needed to be considered and passed and added to the Constitution to rebalance the power between federal and state governments. As Abbott says, the way the founders outlined it to begin with. And so that's the idea, that Greg Abbott has proposed a convention of the states to consider amendments to the federal Constitution, including 9 amendments that he has offered, and I'll describe in just a little while, to bring the federal Constitution back into alignment with the founders' goals for a balance between federal and state power that probably lean toward the states as opposed to concentrating power at the national level. So before we talk about the governor's proposals, I want us to think a little bit about the place of constitutional conventions and constitutions in democratic politics. In democratic theory, a constitutional convention is understood to be the whole people meeting for the purpose of considering their constitutional institutions, the powers those institutions will wield, and how people will achieve positions that allow them to employ those powers. So a convention of the states or a constitutional convention in democratic theory is the whole people meeting together to establish the fundamentals of their political life. What will the institutions of government be? What powers will those institutions have? Who will wield those powers? And how do people achieve positions in which they would deploy those powers? President of the United States Senator, Congressman, and other offices. So a constitutional convention establishes the institutions, powers, jurisdictions, and official positions of government. And once a constitution is proposed, it is ratified by the people. Parliamentary procedures to produce legislation is legal and binding at the end of the process. A written constitution's whole purpose is to remove from government that plenary authority to legislate on any topic that comes to mind, and to limit the institutions of government, the powers that those institutions have. And so if you think about the U.S. Constitution, Article 1 deals with the legislature. Article 1, Section 8 is the powers of Congress. And there are 17 enumerated powers, 17 specifically listed powers: to tax, to borrow money, to raise an army, to manage. A vote of the people legitimates the Constitution, which is then foundational, fundamental law for the society. And then as long as Congress is operating within its constitutional boundaries, it makes law, and bureaucracy establishes regulation. So there is a 3-level priority: constitutions, legislation, and regulation. And so constitutions establish the fundamentals of government authority, and constitutional conventions provide those documents. So let me talk just a little bit about what Constitution has meant over the course of Western intellectual history, even before our Constitutional Convention of 1787, so we can see what an innovation the U.S. Constitution was as a written document designed to limit political power in a way that power had not been limited in earlier periods in history. Aristotle wrote a book called The Constitution of Athens. Aristotle wrote about 4 or 5 centuries before the birth of Christ. So the idea of a constitution was present even in Greek and Roman history, well before European and American history. So the idea has been around for a long time. But for the first 2,000 years, the idea of a constitution was similar to the way we talk about a human constitution or a person's constitution. as being healthy or unhealthy. A healthy individual constitution is a constitution in which all the limbs, all the muscles, all the internal organs are performing as they should, making for a healthy, vibrant, strong, capable person. So what constitutions meant to the Greeks and the Romans and to early Europeans into the American founding era was a constitution was what people called a constitution was the normal institutions of government and their standard operating processes and procedures. So a constitution was the established institutions of government and their normal operating processes and procedures. So that it was difficult for a government to do anything unconstitutional because the standard institutions and the way they normally work would produce a law, and if they were the regular institutions operating in the regular way, that law was thought to be binding and authoritative. So even to this day, the British have an unwritten constitution. An unwritten constitution has trouble sorting out illegitimate political authority, because if the institutions are the right ones and they're operating in the normal way, what they produce is thought to be authoritative and binding. And so the American contribution to constitutional theory was the idea of a written constitution. The American states had written constitutions from the beginning. Most of them were colonial charters produced in Britain for the various American colonies. But after independence, those charters were converted into written constitutions that described the institutions of government, the powers those institutions would have, and how those powers would operate. And the states initially recognized the need for a national authority. And that national authority was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was a Congress without an executive, without a federal judiciary. And that Articles of Confederation gave very limited authority to the National Congress, because we just fought a revolution against what we thought was oppressive authority from the British King and Parliament. So when we created our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, we gave very limited powers. No power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, to manage the economy. And so within 5 or 6 years, people, particularly conservatives, began to think that the Articles of Confederation were too oriented toward state sovereignty and autonomy, not enough toward national authority. And so a constitutional convention was called by the Congress of the Articles of Confederation to meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to, and this is a quote from the call, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. So the Congress of the Articles of Confederation called a federal or constitutional convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation that would make them more competent to the task of governing. George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, 55 people we now call the Founding Fathers. The top, most respected state political and national officials of the day attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They arrived in a room. If you've been to Philadelphia, you've probably seen this room. It's half the size of this room. They looked at each other and they said, we don't think amendments to the Articles of Confederation will be sufficient to the exigencies of the Union. we don't think just amending the Articles of Confederation are going to accomplish the task of making the government competent to governance. So they locked the doors, they sealed the windows, they swore each other to secrecy, and they wrote a whole new constitution. Right? That's why people worry about a convention of the states. Right? Because if a convention of the states is a meeting of the whole people for the purpose of considering the fundamentals of their government, right? If it's the whole people, who can tell them they can't do what they want to do, right? And a convention of the states is elected representatives of the people, right? So they're representing the whole people. So the concern that people have about calling a convention of the states is the idea of a runaway convention. That, like the first constitutional convention in 1787, the members might get there, they might look at each other and say, let's go for it, and close the doors, seal the windows, swear each other to secrecy, and write a new constitution. Now that's not going to happen, right? I mean, that is the runaway convention scenario. A more realistic sense of what could happen is that a convention of the states in 2019 or 2020 or 21 would be called to reconsider an existing political structure with which many people are dissatisfied in part but not in total. And so the concern with a constitutional convention in general is that it's not subject to limitation because it's the whole people meeting to consider the fundamentals of the government. But a convention of the states called to reconsider an existing constitution might be able to be limited to a certain set of 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 issues. And so our modern Congress might execute the call and limit the topics, but a convention of the states is foundational, it's fundamental, it's the people. And so you can say, yeah, but we got these other concerns, right? We got 8, 9, and 10. So the idea of a convention of the states, the people who worry a lot about it say they're not subject to control because of their place in democratic theory, right? Whereas others would point out that we're not talking about a convention to develop a constitution de novo from scratch. We got a constitution. We're talking really about how to amend that constitution, what amendments we might consider to it. But that's the key point, that a constitutional convention, the understanding of a constitutional convention in democratic theory is John Locke, social contract theory, people coming together to establish their government from scratch. And people can establish any kind of government with any kind of institutions, any kind of powers that they might think appropriate. A reconsideration, a convention of the states to reconsider, maybe not quite so fundamental, maybe not quite so dangerous in terms of a runaway convention, but that is something to think about and consider. The founders, when they wrote the American Constitution, had a particular logic built into that Constitution. An unwritten Constitution, like the British still have, assumes that Parliament has plenary powers, complete power to legislate and govern, and that whatever Parliament does through its normal interstate commerce, treaties, all of that kind of stuff. So a written Constitution's whole purpose is to limit and delineate the jurisdiction of Congress, the areas in which they can appropriately legislate. And the idea then becomes more clear that if Congress passes a law, even if the president signs it, and that law arguably is outside the enumerated powers or areas of jurisdiction of the Congress, what happens? The federal courts say that's unconstitutional. It is binding, void, of no effect. So a written constitution has those kinds of limits that allows and promotes the idea of unconstitutional behavior of government trying to operate outside the areas that they are legitimately allowed to operate in. And that federal responsibility, federal court's responsibility to call balls and strikes on the political branches of government, the legislature and the executive, derives, as many of you know, and some of you better than me, from Marbury versus Madison, maybe the most famous U.S. Supreme Court case in our national history from 1803. But because the founders knew that constitutions, well, what the founders knew and thought was that constitutions were fundamental, they were foundational, they needed to be stable and secure if they were going to set the parameters for congressional and executive activity, but they couldn't be unchanging. Constitutions needed to have a mechanism where they could be amended, where they could be changed as circumstances seem to require. And so the Constitution has Article 5, which provides an amendment process. And it's a little bit complicated, but if I go a little slow and maybe repeat a bit, we can sort of lay it out there. And that is Article 5, the amendment article in the Constitution says, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. So it says both houses of Congress, by a 2/3 vote, can propose amendments to the Constitution. Or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Now we have 27 amendments so far to the U.S. Constitution. All of them have gone through that congressional proposal route because Congress are professional politicians, right? They presumably, half of them are lawyers. They know what constitutions are, they know what they do, they know how sort of delicate they are. And so Congress has never turned loose of the amendment proposing responsibility. All 27 amendments were proposed by the Constitution by a 2/3 vote of both houses, and then they go to the states for ratification. We have never had a convention of the states because the congressmen go, since I forgot to put on my thing here, I assume we're not on the internet, so I'll say, congressmen say, holy shit, we don't know what those guys would do, right? If we call a convention of the states, we're not sure, right? It's out of our hands, it's out of our control, we're nervous about it. It is a constitutional provision. A convention of the states is an appropriate mechanism for offering amendments to the Constitution. But it's one we've never used as a country because Congress has maintained control of that process because maybe they're power hungry, maybe they're careful, right? You can sort of decide which one of those you think is closest to it. But the Article 5 of the Constitution provides for amendments. It gives two routes for proposing amendments through Congress and through a convention of the states. We've only used the congressional route to this point because of concerns about a convention of the states. Now, however an amendment is proposed, it has to be ratified by the people, right? Popular sovereignty, popular ratification of the Constitution initially of any amendments to it that might be added at a later date. And as I said, so far there have been 27. And it said In either case, congressional or convention of states, the amendment shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. So Congress can propose an amendment, or convention of states. Congress has only done it. State legislatures, and Congress decides whether state legislatures or conventions of states will be the vehicle for ratification. And Congress has always decided, at least in 26 of 27 amendment processes, that state legislatures, again, elected politicians trusting themselves, state legislatures have been the ratifying mechanism in 26 of the 27 amendments. And the 27th was the 21st Amendment, where state ratification conventions struck down the, what do you call the amendment that said
Prohibition.
Prohibition. Struck down prohibition. Now, the politicians figured they could let us vote on that one. We were going to strike down prohibition, so they didn't figure that was very dangerous. But that's the mechanism. And the point there is that Congress and state legislatures have been very careful to control that amendment process for reasons that I have described. Just a couple more big points before we get to the governor's proposals. And one of those is after the Constitution was in place, it was from the very beginning a subject of great controversy as to what it meant. The Constitution, if you have read it recently, and you all read it probably in high school, maybe even more recently, maybe you carry a pocket Constitution around with you, but it's a relatively brief document, about 12,000 words. Almost half of it is Article 1, governing the legislature, and then the next largest article is Article 2 on the executive, and then it sort of dribbles off into smaller articles, and then those 27 amendments. But the language in the Constitution is often quite general, right? It's not specific, it's not detailed, it's not, you can do this, you can't do that. In general terms, like interstate commerce, power to tax and borrow money, those kinds of things. And in the early days of the Constitution, there was a deep division between mostly northern politicians, beginning with Alexander Hamilton, going through people like Henry Clay to Abraham Lincoln, on to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and later figures who took a national view of the Constitution, that the Constitution empowered a national government, made it supreme in the areas of its legitimate jurisdiction, and that the states were to follow in the wake of the national Constitution. It's mostly a northern view. The southern view, beginning with Thomas Jefferson, going through John C. Calhoun to Jefferson Davis, and then that view sort of peters out, right? Because the Civil War comes and the North wins, the South loses. But from the very beginning, there was a dispute about what the meaning of the general terms in the Constitution implied, what they allowed, what they prohibited. So it was always subject to dispute between those who thought about national power, those who thought about states' rights. Now you go forward 230 years. When we talk about the Constitution, we're really not talking simply about the language in the document. When we think about what's constitutional and what's unconstitutional, because we've got 230 years of federal court cases, many of them emanating from the United States Supreme Court, that has interpreted, elaborated, defined, and specified every one of those broad general phrases in the Constitution, right? So the federal courts and their decisions and their opinions, from Marbury versus Madison to the Obamacare cases, interpret and refine and define the meaning of the Constitution. So there has been a long-running debate about constitutional interpretation and what judges do. So the Constitution is brief and mostly couched in general terms. And the federal courts, including the United States Supreme Court, have issued thousands of opinions as to the meaning of particular aspects of the Constitution. So what the Constitution means today is the original language plus all of those accumulated precedents, right, established by the court. So there is a long argument, impassioned argument about constitutional interpretation and how it should be done. And it's generally a dispute between what is called original intent, or originalism, or literalism. This is Antonin Scalia, right? Original intent, or originalism, or literalism. And that is a conservative argument that says when you interpret constitutional language, what you should be trying to do is to understand what the word or the phrase meant to the people who wrote it in their day. Interpret it literally, and more than that, interpret it in its original meaning. So commerce simply meant something different to Alexander Hamilton than it would mean to Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, let alone today, right? Commerce is that sailing ship, right, coming in from France. And now it's international flights, right? And so interstate commerce meant one thing, and now it means different things. And if you're a conservative, what you're trying to do is to slow down constitutional reinterpretation and evolution. You're trying to say, look, the whole point of a constitution is to establish a foundation for legitimate governmental authority. And so the Constitution has to mean something, and it has to mean what it meant to the people who wrote it and the people who ratified it, expecting us to live under it until we formally amended it to change its meaning. So if you are a conservative, as most of you are, you probably want to look closely at Antonin Scalia's arguments about original intent, because he's saying the Constitution is what it meant to the people who wrote it and what the words meant in their day. And if you want it to mean something different today, amend the Constitution so that it has that new meaning. Now, Antonin Scalia was a very smart guy. Died a couple years ago down in South Texas. But he was a very smart guy. He knew that he can't just do original intent, right? Because we're such a different country 230 years later. But it's an injunction to go very slowly and carefully and to credit the meaning and intent of the founding generation. Not that you're never going to change anything, not that every change that's made has to be a formal constitutional amendment, but don't go willy-nilly, right? Don't go, oh, look, I found privacy. Oh, look, I found gay marriage. You might be in support of gay marriage, but it doesn't mean that you can necessarily find it in the Constitution, is what Scalia would say, right? And so original intent is the conservative position. And it's also called originalism or literalism. The liberal position is identified with Stephen Breyer, who is a current Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and a famous judge, whose name I would tell you if I could remember, maybe I didn't put it in there. We'll go with Breyer. Breyer is the leading member of the Supreme Court behind the idea of a living constitution. And the idea of a living constitution is that the Constitution is relatively brief, it's couched in general terms, but it has principles that have to be honored and have to be made real as the country evolves. And so the Constitution should be allowed to breathe. If it favors liberty, liberty in 1787 is for a different set of people than we mean liberty to be for today, right? So liberty means something different. It's a fundamental value of the Constitution, but if you just allow it to mean what it meant to Thomas Jefferson, right? It's not going to honor our values today, so you got to allow it to evolve as social perspectives and cultural expectations evolve. You've got to allow the Constitution to find those new values. And it's largely the role of the United States Supreme Court to watch the development of cultural values and opinions and not get out in front of them, but to legitimate them as they become the general presumptions of the society, right? Conservatives will say the court gets way out in front, right? But liberals will say, look, we've got to allow the values that we hold today to find voice in the Constitution as well. So those debates will go on. Your position generally is original intent. Democrats and liberals generally argue for a living Constitution, one that evolves not simply through constitutional amendment, but through Supreme Court interpretations that are aware of and listening to the evolution of cultural and social assumptions over time. Into this debate steps the great man, Greg Abbott, with a proposal, as I've said, in his 2016 book called Broken But Unbowed. One of the more difficult responsibilities I have as a college professor and a presumed expert in American politics and Texas politics is when Perry writes a book called Fed Up, I have to read it. And when Greg Abbott writes a book called Broken But Unbowed, I have to read it. Most of these political books are not great literature, and they're not nearly as deep as they are long. So I will tell you that I have read this book by Greg Abbott, and there's an easier path for you to take. If you type in Governor Abbott's constitutional amendment proposals, he did a press release in 2016, which has like 3 or 4 paragraphs of explanation of what he has in mind, and then these 9 constitutional amendments. And so you get a flavor of it, and I'll go relatively quickly through it. And then we'll talk a little bit about some UT and Texas Tribune poll results on his ideas, and then we'll go to questions and answers. I love politicians. If you remember back to high school and the discussion of the Constitutional Convention, it began with James Madison consulting with George Washington and then developing an agenda for the Constitutional Convention that was called the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan then became the basis for the American Constitution. Lots of changes, but the basic intellectual foundation came out of the Virginia Plan. But there was an opposing plan by states' rights, small government people who wanted more of the Articles of Confederation kept and less of Madison's bigger government sort of proposal. And so they offered an alternative called the New Jersey Plan. What do you suppose Governor Abbott called his plan. A Texas plan, right? I mean, all right, Madison is spinning, you know, what's his idea? So Governor Abbott's Texas plan was intended, as he said in his press release, to restore the rule of law and return the Constitution to its intended purposes. Congress routinely violates its enumerated powers. The president exceeds his executive powers to impose heavy-handed regulations. The Supreme Court imposes its policy views under the guise of judicial interpretation. So Governor Abbott urged action by Texas and the other states to restore the rule of law in America. So Governor Abbott's concern is that, Governor Abbott's concern is that the sort of states' rights interpretation of what the Constitution originally meant and should continue to mean down through time has been steamrolled by the federal courts in favor of the northern national supremacy view of the Constitution's meaning, and that to restore the original rightful meaning of the Constitution from his perspective, you've got to upgrade the ability of the states to push back against the federal government and limit the ability of the federal government to impose itself on the states. And so very quickly, there are 9 proposed amendments. The first one is to prohibit Congress from regulating activity that occurs wholly within one state. So interstate commerce is one of the most powerful provisions in the Constitution. Because when you think of interstate commerce, you're thinking of commerce that goes across state lines, right? But the Supreme Court has used the power to regulate interstate commerce as the foundation for the Civil Rights Act of 1965, right? Because it governed who could eat in restaurants and stay in hotels, and that's commercial activity, right? So that phrase, interstate commerce, has been used to legitimate all kinds of large, conservatives would say, intrusive federal government action. And throughout the 19th century of American history, that phrase, interstate commerce, under conservative courts, meant and only meant that Congress can regulate commerce as it moves between states, right? So, trains. You can have ICC. But if you're talking about production, as conservatives argued in the 19th century, production is point production. It's somewhere, right? Productions, factories, that kind of stuff. So Congress can't come in and regulate factories, hours, work, labor standards, because that's within a state. So Governor Abbott is going back to that earlier view of government, of legitimate congressional federal government activity as not applying to stuff that happens within a single state. Second one is require Congress to pass a balanced budget. That's been on the books for a long time. Hasn't happened, but the governor has it in here as number 2. And then we get to some interesting ones. The next 2 prohibit administrative agencies and the unelected bureaucrats who staff them from creating federal laws, right? So federal agencies write regulations that implement laws passed by Congress. Congress passes general laws, doesn't deal with every circumstance, so regulatory agencies specify. And what Abbott is saying here, prohibit administrative agencies from creating federal laws. And he threw in that, and the unelected bureaucrats who staff them for, just for punch. That is essentially saying, Congress, do your job. When you write a law, write it fully and completely, so that it covers all the circumstances you have in mind. Don't let these unelected bureaucrats do the rest of your job for you. 4, prohibit administrative agencies and the unelected bureaucrats who staff them. This is a different one, but same language. From preempting state law. So prohibit administrative agencies, you can think about the EPA, right? From preempting state law. So if state law covers sort of medicine, marriage, those kinds of things, federal government can't preempt them. Fifth one is allow 2/3 majority of the states to override a Supreme Court decision. Maybe, right? You're thinking school prayer, right? Maybe you could get 2/3 of the states to override a Supreme Court decision on school prayer. But they could also override a decision on an issue near your heart, right? Works both ways. Second, fifth, I guess this is, sixth maybe, require a 7-justice supermajority vote for the United States Supreme Court to invalidate democratically enacted laws, which presumably means laws in Congress and in state legislatures. You need a 7-2 rather than the current 5-4 Supreme Court majority to declare something unconstitutional. Just a couple more. Restore the balance between the power between the federal government and state governments by limiting the former, the federal government, to the powers expressly delegated to it by the Constitution. When you get home tonight, crack a beer, and then get your pocket Constitution out and look at Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers of Congress. It is very brief, very general terms. You cannot find a modern federal government in that list of enumerated powers, right? So this is a proposal to cut back to early 19th century levels, or potentially cut back a very great deal. Two more. Give state officials the power to sue in federal court when federal officials overstep their bounds, right? We sue the federal government all the time. Greg Abbott ran for governor saying, I get up in the morning, I go to work, I sue the federal government, and I go home. It's a great line, right? But we states get to sue the federal government all the time, but this is when federal officials overstep their bounds, which is a broad category from the governor's perspective. And the last one, allow a 2/3 majority of the states to override a federal law or regulation. So Congress passes a law, President signs it, goes into effect, 2/3 of states, through a process not described yet, can override the federal law. This was a point, this sort of balance between federal and state authority and who's overseeing who under the Constitution was a major point of debate in the Federal Convention. James Madison in the Virginia plan had what was called the universal negative, which was state governments have to send their proposed laws to the Congress to be evaluated and approved before they could go into effect. And other members of the convention said, Jim, that's too heavy-handed. You know, you've got to respect the sovereignty of the states. You can't have them send their laws up to us to be approved before they go into effect. And so the universal negative is not in the Constitution. But Governor Abbott's proposal here is that the states will be in a number of different ways and fora overseeing the actions of the federal government and eliminating the ones that seem to them inappropriate if they can muster the 2/3 vote among the states. Now, I am only aware of one Texas poll, and that is UT and Texas Tribune poll results for June 2017. And it shows that a majority of Texans and a majority of all political parties are concerned about these proposals. And so 54% of voters oppose a convention of the states. These are Texas voters. 54% oppose a convention of the states, while 28% support it, and 18% aren't sure. That 18% number should be larger, because I think most of us have to think it through, think about a lot of these things and whether any of them make sense. But 2 to 1, people are not really eager to mess with the federal Constitution. Among Democrats, 55% are opposed, 26% support, 19% don't know. Among non-Tea Party Republicans, 61% are opposed. That's more, right? The math, 55 to the Democrats, 61 to the non-Tea Party Republicans, 26% support, 13% don't know. Tea Party voters are always firm in their convictions. 57% opposed, 40% approved, and only 3% didn't know. So 3% of Tea Parties didn't know, but 19% of everybody else didn't know. So I think, let me just sort of summarize that idea of what a convention of the states is in democratic theory is what makes people worry about tinkering with the U.S. Constitution. There's a process to amend it. A convention of the states wouldn't necessarily run away, but it's not inconceivable. It really is pretty inconceivable. I mean, you couldn't possibly have anything like 1787, because people were going to let Washington and Madison and the boys do pretty much what they want. So they were told to go develop some amendments. They went in there, said that's not going to be enough. Close the doors, close the windows. This is Philadelphia summer, right? Closed the doors and windows, swore each other to secrecy. Very little leaked out over 3.5 months, and they popped up with the Constitution offered for ratification, which the states ultimately did ratify. Imagine Sean Hannity climbing down the stovepipe to get into that convention. You couldn't think of the media in general, right? You couldn't have that kind of, off the radar, mature discussion, problem-solving compromise over months. People would come out the first day. I stand for 1, 2, 3, 4 positions. I will never compromise. I'm a man of principle. The other guy says, I've got 4 things. I'll never compromise. I'm a man of principle, and you're done, right? So right now, Texas and 27 other states have agreed in principle to the need for a convention of the states. It's got to get to 34. We're going to have an election in November. Will that help or hurt momentum toward a convention of the states? Yeah, I thought you were going to answer my question. Classes at SMU start on Monday. I ask a question, somebody raises their hand, naturally I assume. But that's it. I would be surprised if we have one. Congress would probably find a way to have one. Yeah.
Please, one moment, please. Stand up and identify yourself and then ask your question.
Jeff Reese, I'm from Arlington. I'm part of the convention. I'm a new person, so I'm not as articulate on the convention of states. But I was under the impression that you could have a convention of states for one topic. You could call it for, you want to have term limits to the federal Congress people who are never going to vote for that maybe the majority of the states, the people in the states are for it. Maybe they're not and it won't be called. And to me, that's very transparent. It's out in the public. Every state can say, we're for term limits, we're against term limits, whatever. And to me, if you pick it on one, I'm not talking about what Greg Abbott did, but if because I would be against most of those actually. But if you were gonna call, there may be things that people in 38 states might agree on that the Congress will never do, and the courts maybe have too much power to make a decision on. So I don't see how that could be a problem.
Yeah.
I mean,
Respond.
okay, yeah.
Yeah. People who favor a convention of the states argue that, of course you could limit it, right? But I think more likely, if it were going to be something like term limits, when the 33rd state approved a convention of the states, and you can identify someone who might be 34, Congress would, within a week, come out with an amendment proposing term limits through its own devices, limited only to that, right? So that it couldn't get out of control. But you do hear the argument that, well, of course you can limit it and be talking about these 4 things. But the logic within democratic theory of what a convention is, right? It is a specific thing. It is the people embodied for the purpose of establishing a government or changing it, akin to the right to revolution. Right? And so when the people are embodied and meeting for the purpose of determining their governmental structure, I would say, we came here to do this term limit thing, this other thing is popular. Let's talk a little bit about that, right? So, it sounds like you could do it just the way you said, but you'd have to do it to another institution. A convention of the states is a specific thing.
Okay, question? Stand up and ask a question.
Susan Fletcher, Program Cal. Help me unravel this. So you talked about unelected bureaucrats. So when you have a convention of the states, doesn't the legislature pick the person who may not be an elected? Where's the accountability back to the people, we the people, because we elected our Congress? So where's the accountability back to the people? Wouldn't that person that would be going to the convention of states be an unelected bureaucrat themselves to be voting against unelected bureaucrats having power? I'm struggling with that.
Right,
and I'm also,
right.
the second part is that I'm also struggling with, okay, you've got a constitution and we want to have a convention of states to say, let's follow the constitution that we have, that if we create new amendments, what makes us think they're going to follow those if they don't follow the current ones? So that's,
yeah, right.
Elaborate.
Yeah, I think the idea would be that they would at least follow them for a while, whether a while was 10 years or 100 years, they would at least follow them for a while if they knew. The accountability piece comes on the other end, ratification, right? Because this convention of the states is going to propose one or more amendments, and then those have to go to the states for ratification, either state legislatures or state conventions. So I don't know whether or not what people are signing up to as a convention of the states has a delegate selection mechanism in it. Maybe you or someone who's supporting the idea.
Senate Bill 21 in Texas. The legislature. I'm Paul Hodson, State Director Emeritus here in Texas, Regional Director for the Convention of States Project. Senator Birdwell, Senate Bill 21, which was companion legislation. The states get to decide who goes. And in Texas, it's going to be 3 members of the House with 3 alternates and 2 members of the Senate picked by the legislature. But each state gets to decide who goes. It's up to the states.
Yeah. So one of the problems is that, assuming you get 34 states to approve a convention of the states, you're going to have 34 states approving slightly different stuff, right? And maybe that'll work, maybe it won't. But it'll look messy to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it's very important for those who favor it to try to be as clear as possible about how it would work and whether there is some sort of uniformity within the process.
All right, young lady, stand up and then
Sharon Terrell. and I'm a supporter of convention states, as you can see. I'm unclear about something you said. You made it sound like one of the reasons we haven't had one up till this point is because Congress has sort of kept it from happening. Almost like they have the power or the authority to just say, we don't want to have one after all, even though you won't vote for it. But that's not true, is it? I mean, there's been many applications for it, and my understanding is they're sort of waiting for them to aggregate, as we say, to all be on the same topic, and there's a lot of question about what that looks like, and that's why Convention States is very strict about the way we have the wording of our applications.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have the authority to just say, we're not going to call it convention because we don't like the idea.
No, there have been proposals throughout American history for conventions of the states, but none of them have produced a convention of the states because Congress is wary and careful, so they pick the low-hanging fruit. They develop themselves the amendments that they think a majority opinion has developed behind, and that saps the momentum for a convention of the states. So they can't legally not do it, but there are lots of policies.
All right, Wendell?
Wendell Brock. So can you talk about the doctrine of nullification and why the states aren't using that to oppose many of these crazy federal laws and push back?
Yeah.
There's that great book that Thomas Woods wrote about nullification and the tyranny of the federal government in the 21st century, et cetera.
Right. There are a set of related ideas. Nullification and secession are closely related ideas. Nullification is the idea, as Governor Abbott has there in number 1, or 2, I guess, that if the federal government passes a law that a state believes is unconstitutional, is outside its areas of legitimate authority, it can nullify it within its boundaries, refuse to enforce it, and so marijuana laws are by federal law illegal, but they're selling marijuana in California and Colorado and lots of other places because the federal government, when a state resists, nullifies, sort of informal nullification, has to decide how to respond, roll the tanks, or just say, oh, come on, this is, you're violating federal law, try not to embarrass yourself. So nullification, informally, the federal government puts up with it as it thinks appropriate, but as people advise Leander Perez, I don't know if anyone here knows who Leander Perez is. He was the president of Plaquemine Parish in Louisiana. I used to teach at LSU. He was an opponent of civil rights legislation, and so we would sweep up civil rights workers and put them on an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. And people went to Leander and says, Leander, you can't do that, the Fed's got to bomb, right? And so nullification, if opposed by the federal government with various kinds of force, financial, other, can be overcome. The idea of nullification is also that if the federal government passes a series of noxious laws that a state considers to be outside the legitimate purview of the federal government, they can secede from the union. States join the union of their own volition. They can leave of their own volition. You Texans know that discussion that Texas can secede if it wants to, or cut itself into 5 states if it wants to. Sorry.
This young man here.
Just 1 second.
All right.
That made sense up until the end of the Civil War, right? Texas versus white solved it. So nullification is real still. Secession is not. Yeah.
This man here, sir.
Yes. Professor, would you mind, I don't know how many people here have the U.S. Constitution, but I happen to bring it. And the reason I did is I'm actually working up a class to teach the Constitution Week, September the 17th.
What is your question?
My question is this: would you mind reading the first 52 words of the Constitution.
Starting with "we the people."
Yeah, do you have it memorized?
I don't have it memorized, at least I won't trust myself.
I want you to
We can all
read it.
benefit by a little reading. of the
I want you to
Constitution.
read it, sir, and then discuss the 6 principles that were still supposed to apply to the Constitution.
I don't know if I can do that, but I can read the preamble. It is great stuff. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings and liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States.
Some people believe that those are 6 concepts. Oh, my name is Greg Holton, and I'm a representative with Senate District 2, and I come from Hopkins County. I went to San Antonio for the convention. But some people in my study of teaching the Constitution believe that those 6 concepts applied when it was written, and they should still apply today. And I think the majority of Americans believe it. Therefore, we need to allow the majority of Americans, we the people, to have an opportunity to discuss it. We don't need Washington, D.C., which was created to do those things sovereign states couldn't do.
Yeah. I'm sure it is true that many people believe that those words were meant to guide the nation into the future and should still be doing that today. The problem is the United States Supreme Court says that the preamble is not operational language. That you can't draw just on the preamble as foundation for legitimate governmental authority. That's Article 1, Section 8, that sort of stuff, that this is, these are our values, but they're not operational parts of the Constitution.
Okay, right here.
I'm
Stand
doing
up,
right
man.
here. I'm Jane Nancy, I live here in Plano. I would like for you to interpret for me, if someone says they're a constitutional conservative, what does that mean?
Well, that generally means that they're a, what was that phrase that Mitt Romney used? Not strict conservative. Anybody remember?
Severe.
Yeah,
Severe.
Constitutional conservative, it just means a strict literalist. Remember that stuff about, yeah, that's what it means. It means a strict literalist.
So they are supporting the Constitution as it is now?
That has generally been what that would mean.
Okay, well, this gentleman back here.
You over $5? You over $5?
Yeah.
I know that look.
Shelby Williams, I live here in Plano, State Director for the Convention of States. Do you happen to have the actual question that was asked in that UT Texas Tribune poll? Was it a leading question?
I do have that, and I'll be happy to leave it with you. Yeah, it's right here. Well, it says, I don't have the whole language. It says essentially, do you think the Constitution is held up well and should be left alone? Do you think it needs change and we should hold a convention of states, or don't know?
Okay.
So-
Young lady, or is that, okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Karina Button, Plano, Harrington Republican Women. There are 27 states that have called for a constitutional convention. How long do those calls stand? You said that they've done over the course of time. So I'm thinking these have gone back 10 years.
Yeah.
So how long, do they just sit there forever and all of a sudden in 25 years it happens?
Yeah, I looked this up a little bit today, and there are people in the room who know more about this than I do. I'm just asked to talk, so I do it for a living. There are 28 live calls for a convention of the states, 27 plus Texas, and the last constitutional amendment that was adopted, the 27th, I believe, maybe it's 26th, is the one that you can't have pay raise to Congress.
It's the 27th.
Until another Congress has met. That was one of the original ones back in 1789, and it just sort of hung around and finally got the support and went in. So it's kind of up to Congress to decide what is live and what's not. Some states pass them with a limit, right? So, you know, it's a little loose.
Could you clarify that question? I was trying to understand, just to clarify the question
Yeah.
again.
Is it the case that when a state approves a call for a constitutional amendment, that approval is in perpetuity?
Okay.
Or are there time limits? When does approval sort of fall away?
Could you elaborate on that about the request to have a convention of the states? How long, if the legislature says we want to do this, it's always a new legislature every 2 years.
Right.
So how long does that last?
Depends on the
If you're
resolution.
counting, if you're at however many now and you need 34,
Yeah.
how long does that last?
I think the problem is really that some legislators,
Wait a minute.
I think the problem is that some legislatures approve it for a period of time, and then they're thought to no longer be live. Some approve it for a longer time, so maybe in perpetuity. Any future legislature could withdraw,
Right.
and some have.
All right, Professor Lee, you want to say something?
Yeah,
Or stand up, sir.
as I recall, the one passed by Texas has a date on it.
Yes, it does.
So, yeah, so I mean, that's the answer to the question, they have a date. And most constitutional amendments do. I'm curious though, see, I think we're kind of at the heart of the issue, which is that it's never going to happen. Because all of the states, and I'm not for it, by the way,
Right.
so I'm good. The founders did a lot better job than anybody's gonna do today. Okay, we got clowns in our government. We're gonna make this happen, please. I'm supposed to ask questions.
I want the internet to know that it was the other profession.
I think the word is corrupt.
But it seems that, this is the question, if I'm sitting in Congress and I'm evaluating these 28, they now turn into 34, if they're all distinctly different, I'm looking at nothing. So it seems like these people who crashed our meeting tonight and are all state convention and they're trying to know all about it, they gotta all get together and pass the same thing, don't they?
Well,
Because Congress does have to approve it, don't they?
yeah,
And they have to have something to approve.
yeah, they have to approve. See, the problem is that Congress is skittish, right? If they see a development getting near 34, they're going to want to try to preempt a convention of states. They're going to want to do something, figuring that there's enough impetus behind it that they should. So, you know, I think there's a reason we haven't had one in 230 years. I don't think we're going to have one here. But I think that, you know, if you look at those 9 things from Greg Abbott, that's the Articles of Confederation and the Confederate Constitution. It's close to rebalancing far in the direction of the states and neutering the federal government. And we would before long find out that that isn't exactly to our benefit.
All right, let's get the
Point of clarification.